Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Good to see you guys. Hope you're having a good day wherever you're at, whatever you're watching this. It's 10 minutes till class time, so just get comfortable. I'm starting the stream early just to kind of have a margin of time for those that might arrive a few minutes early. But if you're watching this later, you probably skip out to the 10-minute mark and you'll start to see the beginning of the lecture. But yeah, I want you guys to try and attend live. Obviously, this is a synchronous class, so yeah, be present, be keeping attendance and everything like that. But no rush, just hanging in there for a few minutes while we, wait for some of us to arrive. 1 second, I'll be right back. Just gonna grab something. Hey there, how's it going, Justin? Good to see you. Hi, Jennifer, welcome back. Anthony, good to see you. Thanks, guys, for being here. Just hanging in there till 4, so we got like 6.5 minutes. Thanks. Hey there, Santino. Welcome, guys. See more of us starting to get here into the stream, so welcome back. Another 5 minutes, and then we'll get into the lecture. Hi, Jasmine. Good afternoon. Hey, Jim, welcome back. Jasmine McMahon, welcome. Been pretty good so far. My day. Let's see. I had an early morning lecture at 8:30. Then I had a decent break, so I've just kind of been relaxing at home, prepping for this one. Feel like the semester's off to a nice, smooth start, so can't complain. Hi, Leanne. Just 3 minutes or so. Hey, Jerome. Hello, Nate. Welcome. Sandra, good to see you too. Hey, Carson. Good to see you there. Just 2 minutes, basically. Everything sounding and looking okay on your side, just making sure there's no problems with the stream. Seems like it's pretty good since you can hear me and see me based on your responses. But let me know, if there's ever any problems or anything like that. Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah. Just running this on my MacBook Pro from 2018. So, it's still pretty good. See if I have to upgrade in the next couple years. Hi, Elena. Andrea, welcome back. Good to see you too. To those just arriving, just hanging in there till 4, and then I'll get my comments and notes ready to go for you guys. Okay. Hey, Zach, welcome back. Hey, Mary Jane, good to see you too. All right, based on my clock, we're pretty much now at the 4 o'clock top of the hour. Welcome back, Julian, as well. So all you guys that are here, thanks so much for being here and having another meeting with me on YouTube Live. I think most all of you that have already arrived at the live stream have made a comment, but if you haven't, please just say hello or something. This is just my kind of informal method of checking attendance, and I'll do that again at the end when we're done. To those watching this, whether live or on delay later, just make sure that you keep coming to the live stream because we're supposed to be doing this class live. This isn't supposed to be just watch the videos later, but at the same time, watch the videos later if nothing else, but you do want to try and be live. So I sent out a little announcement on Canvas just before this to kind of remind folks to arrive to the live stream at 4. I'm not going to do that every time just because I want it to kind of just be the normal routine that you just know that we're having it at 4 o'clock on YouTube. So don't think that if I didn't post a little reminder like that, that there's no class. There's always going to be class. I'm a person that does not miss class. So we're doing this Tuesday, Thursdays, 4 to 5:15. At least I'm doing it. So I'll be here on the live stream and you should tune in. But again, welcome back to everybody. Julian, Giannis, Rosemary, everybody else that we've seen. Good to see you guys. So let me just get things started with this. We're going to continue through our lecture notes and series of topics. Last time we kind of wrapped up more having to do with utilitarian ethics. I'll just summarize a little bit of that. And towards the very end of the last lecture, we started to get into the other major ethical theory that we're going to learn about, which is the ideas of Immanuel Kant and Kantian ethics. So briefly, just to sort of cap off the whole utilitarianism discussion, so there's different theories of morality, different ethical theories as they're called. These are attempts by writers and philosophers to try and state the conditions that would make an action either right or wrong or obligatory. One very influential writer on ethics was John Stuart Mill, and he is an advocate of the theory of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, by now perhaps becoming a little more familiar to you, is just this idea that the right action is whichever action that will create the greatest overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So when you face decisions about what to do, they would advise that the right thing in any scenario is whichever action among your options that would result in the greatest overall happiness for all people that are affected by the action. Happiness they consider to be equivalent to pleasure in the absence of pain. So they say we should try and generate as much pleasure or remove as much pain as we can for as many people with each action that we perform. We talked about how it's based on the greatest happiness principle, how it also says that happiness or pleasure is the only thing that people seek as an end and not as a means. In other words, that it's the only goal that all of us have, and that kind of lying behind the motives that we have for all the things we do is the pursuit or the desire for pleasure. So if each action is done for that reason, then he thinks we kind of already implicitly recognize that happiness or pleasure is the good that we seek in life. So maximizing it, as the theory advises, would be the right way to live morally. But after that, we talked a lot about different objections. That was a lot of what we spent time on in the previous meeting. So there are different objections to utilitarianism. On the one hand, some say that it's just too demanding, because if you're going to be a utilitarian, then you would have this kind of constant obligation to take whichever action will create the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. But of course, sometimes that may conflict with what you personally prefer. And in certain cases, it might even deeply contradict certain bonds of loyalty and familiarity that you've already established with people. I gave you, like, say, a hypothetical scenario where we were told if there were 2 houses, each of which was burning, and you could only have time to provide assistance to the people in one of them. If all that you knew was that one house holds 10 people and the other holds 2, and you can't go for both, then the utilitarian would say go for the one that has the greater number of people, 10. But of course, we can imagine that the 2 people located in the other home are very closely related to you, or that you have a loving relationship with. So, isn't it pretty demanding for the theory to expect us to just automatically or robotically take the action that maximizes utility in certain cases like these? Another objection was that so no action is absolutely forbidden in principle. That's definitely probably the biggest and most, I think, substantial objection. Whether it's lying, cheating, stealing, or even killing, we can always imagine situations in which doing that act would create more total happiness than declining to do the act. In certain hypothetical scenarios that I gave you, like the transplant situation, we imagine one person that's innocent and generally healthy being killed in order to take their organs so that those various organs can be donated to 5 people, let's suppose, each of which would need it to survive. In that case, one dies in order to protect or save the lives of 5. But of course, if they're innocent and not willing to participate in this forced donation, it's not a donation, I guess, then the theory would have it that maybe it is the right thing to just sort of take their life regardless, because it maximizes utility. But here again, we see problems because many people think that there are some fundamental actions that should never be performed, or some types of actions that should never be performed. And one other main objection that we talked also about was that some think it's a theory fit for swine. Remember that? The reason that some say this is because if you just look at the theory, it says to maximize pleasure as much as possible. And some people, when they hear the word pleasure, red flags go up and they're thinking, well, are we being told to live like pigs? Just pursue sleeping, eating, reproduction, basic sensual type animalistic pleasures. Isn't that a lowly theory for something as elevated and intelligent as a human? Does anybody remember how Mr. John Stuart Mill replied back to that objection, the one that says the theory is fit for swine? If anybody can remember or has good notes, you could just say a brief word. He tries to say it's actually not a theory for swine because how does he kind of come back? Yeah, he says higher and lower pleasures. That's correct, Mary Jane. Very good. So he says, yeah, it's a theory that says to maximize as much pleasure for people as possible. But then he makes the point that there's different types of pleasures. There's higher, and then there's also lower. Not to worry. Thanks, Miana. Good to see you and all the rest that are here. But yeah, so in response to this point that it's a theory for swine because it's all about pleasure, he says there's higher pleasures and there's lower pleasures. Higher pleasures are pleasures that only humans can experience because they take more, I guess, cognitive sophistication, like reading, sports, science, academic study of any subject whatsoever, dance, theater, film, technology, and we could keep going. But all these things are only uniquely enjoyed by humans because it takes something that is as smart as us to do any of those given things. On the other hand, there are lower pleasures. Those are pleasures that are attainable by animals that are non-human, and that could be sleeping, eating, and mating, and etc. But he says this theory that tells us to maximize happiness and pleasure for people doesn't just say to focus on the lower pleasures. In fact, he goes even a stage farther and says that the higher pleasures are not only exclusive to humans, but they're more important and they have greater value and more worthiness or more weight. So he says, no, it's not a theory for swine. Yes, it's a theory for pleasure, but there's higher pleasures. And for humans, those are actually more important. And he tries to say that they're recognized as the more valuable pleasures because you already know that you would never trade your capacity for the higher pleasures for the more fully satisfied life of like a comfortable pig or something. That's why he says, for example, that it is better to be, unsatisfied human than a satisfied pig. And that's just like a quotation from him. Okay, so now we're continuing to move on, and we have to get back into our topic of Kantian ethics, the writings and ideas of Immanuel Kant. So this author again, Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804, he's just another big historical figure in the world of philosophy and especially ethics. He wrote this book in 1785 called Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. There's a snippet of that's included in our textbook. And he just lays out his own perspective on what's right and wrong in terms of moral theory. So one thing I was telling you about, just as we were closing the previous lecture, is that to him, the main thing to focus on ethically is not the consequences that result from your actions. Instead, he advises that we should consider the intention or the will that the person has when they perform the action. So instead of looking ahead after the action to whatever results come from it, whether they be positive or negative, we should look back to the intention the person had when they did the act in the first place, the intention or will, however you'd like to put it. So that's what matters morally, the will, regardless of the consequences. I gave an example to sort of get you starting thinking about that, which is this hypothetical scenario of a person who, let's say, is on the side of the road with their car looking like it's broken down. Supposing that you pulled over to try and help them, thinking that they might need something like, I don't know, jumper cables, whatever. You notice that they're unconscious in their car, that they're not responding to your questions and so on. And then you notice that there's some light damage to the front of the car with a little smoke coming out of the engine area. So suppose that in that situation, the person who pulled over gently removes the person from the car so that they're not inside of it in case it were to catch fire or explode. Later on, emergency technicians arrive to the scene, paramedics and so on, and they ask you, how did the guy get on the ground? And you say, okay, well, I moved them. Then they tell you, well, even though you thought you were doing the right thing, it's probably dangerous to have done that because, if they had a certain injury, maybe to their spine or neck, then moving them without the proper tools could have induced paralysis from the neck down. And you're like, okay, well, I was just trying to, help them and so on. But then suppose that as it turns out, they really did get paralyzed because of your well-intended but inadvertently harmful action. Now, in this case, if it was purely based on consequences and how they impact total happiness going forward, we would say this was not right because it didn't result in happiness. To the contrary, it led to a lifetime of dissatisfaction. But if it was judged instead based on the characteristic of the person's will, then we would say that there was nothing wrong with it, because after all, it wasn't done out of a bad will or a bad intent. This was not a malicious act. It was done with a virtuous and noble idea of trying to protect the person. So we should focus rather on the intention the person has. Now, we're going to continue from there. That's just my little brief opening statement to kind of get us back into the mode of thinking about ethics in this class. One thing that Kant says next, as he kind of opens up the section of writing that we were looking at, is that the only thing in the world that is unconditionally good is a good will. So I'm going to just type that into the chat. So, claim from Kant. So I just typed out this statement here that Kant holds to be true, and he argues for that. He says that there's only one thing in the world that is unconditionally good. You might wonder, why is the goodwill the sort of centerpiece of his ethical theory? Well, he gives a reason. He says the reason that that's the main concept to sort of focus on in ethics is because, as he argues, the only thing in the whole world that's unconditionally good is a goodwill. Now, what does that mean in other words? It means that the only thing that's good no matter what, the only thing that's good under all conditions, is a goodwill. So that's why he thinks that we should try our best to like maintain and act according to a goodwill. He makes this point by way of contrast. He says that all other qualities that a person could have, like characteristics of their temperament or character, all these other often thought to be desirable qualities, are not unconditionally good. They're only good sometimes, but not in other cases. So to make his point clear to you, I just want us to have a brief little discussion in the chat. Can anybody here in this chat provide an example of a quality that if a person has this quality, like a character trait or whatever, then it's often thought to be praiseworthy and good? So like the sort of quality that you could receive a compliment for. Someone might say, you know, you're a great person because you are so fill in the blank. What could be a quality that's often thought of as, okay, empathetic, there you go, Mary Jane. Selfless, honest, having discipline, being smart. These are all great examples. Generous, having integrity, understanding, respectful, caring. That's all great. Let me even throw out a few others to see if I can prompt you with a few more. Considerate, okay. Altruistic, yes. I want to hit a few others too. Responsibility, good. Taking care of the things that you have obligations to do, that's another one. What about a person who, if there's something risky, they're willing to put themselves in harm's way if it's necessary and right. They're not scared to do that. This is a person who has what quality? You know, the willingness to face danger or risk if needed to do the right thing. That's the person that's got this character quality of heroic, sacrifice, sure, brave. I was kind of thinking in the world of like the word brave or courageous, you know, having courage or bravery. That's another good one. Let's try yet another. I saw intelligence. That's very good. How about a person who easily makes friends and allies? Everyone seems to like this type of person because they have this certain character trait of what? Charming, yes. Charismatic, good. Charisma, another way to put it. That's fair enough. Okay, so how about, I think it's kind of up there. Someone said discipline. This is maybe adjacent to discipline, or I don't know if it's the same thing, but like, what about a person who doesn't give up when there's obstacles? They keep working till they achieve whatever the goal is. So they're a person that's not going to be deterred by those setbacks. Resilient, fair enough. Yeah, resilient, kind of, right? Determined, perseverant, great. Those are basically the words I was trying to get from you. Motivated, all right. So look at all those qualities that you guys have just put here in the chat. They seem good, and they can be, of course. But what Kant says to us is that all of those qualities can be good, but they can also be bad if, for example, the person who possesses the quality has a bad will, okay? So none of these things are unconditionally good that are being listed here. The only thing that is the goodwill itself. Because if you lack a goodwill and instead, let's say, have a bad will or evil intentions, then any of these qualities that are being shown in the chat can be flipped over to becoming something that's actually harmful, dangerous, or bad. So let me just try to run through some of that with you. take the case of intelligence. I saw above someone wrote smart, and that's definitely a good quality, ordinarily, for the most part. But under what circumstances would you say that if this type of person is super smart, it's almost a little scary? If the person who's that smart is like what? Any thoughts? Like, when can intelligence turn to something that's actually scary, dangerous, bad? It's when the person with it is like what? Nuclear weapon creator, you say, Zach. Sure, that's a very specific example. You say dictator, Mary Jane. That's also fair enough. You use the concept weaponized, Jemin. I like that. Or manipulative, Jerome. Sure. So what these qualities that are now being mentioned kind of share in common is that they're the way that a person has action when they have a bad will. So suppose a person is really intelligent and smart, like whatever we've said, but they have this set of evil goals and evil intentions, like an evil genius. Is that a good thing? No. If the person's going to be evil with a bad will, we would probably prefer that they don't have that massive intelligence, because it simply enhances their capacity through the intelligence to be more skillful and successful in whatever evil goals or agenda they may have set for themselves. So if somebody out there is like, stalking you and wants to do harm, you'd probably prefer that they be like an idiot or somebody really dim-witted, so that they're not that capable or effective. The intelligence can be a great thing, of course, when one has a good will. If you have a good will and good intentions, then you're going to use the intelligence, if you have it, to simply create good outcomes and do the right thing morally. But if you're evil with a bad will, then the same intelligence that could have been a good thing if it was with a good person now becomes something that's simply an enhancement to their capacity to do harm, and it turns to be something not good under those conditions. And that's the kind of pattern that you'll see with all of the other qualities that you've listed. Let's go back to, like, say, bravery or courage. Again, the willingness to face danger sometimes when it's needed to achieve your desired outcome. Now, if the person is brave and they have a good will, then that's a fine thing, and it'll only produce good. Like if they're a brave person that's like a, soldier, firefighter, police officer, they're willing to rush into harm's way to do the right thing when it's necessary. But imagine that the person who has this courage is like an evil person with a bad will. That means that they're not going to be scared to take actions that are harmful because they're willing to face those risks and dangers. If the person's going to be evil, you'd probably think, I would rather they not have such strong bravery, because then if they were too cowardly, they'd probably be less likely to act. We don't want them to act if they have the bad will. And on and on and on. Suppose the person has that charisma or that witty character that easily makes them sociable and liked by others. If they have a good will, good intentions, etc., then they're going to use that charismatic personality to win friends and allies to all the important and worthy causes that good people care about. But if they're evil with a bad agenda, maybe they'll use their charisma and so forth to like recruit people to an evil way of thinking or acting. So in that case, we'd rather that the evil person with a bad will not be so socially skilled and charismatic, because it just, again, increases the probability that something bad or wrong would be done. Now, some of these you may think, how could they be flipped into something that's not good? Like, okay, if somebody's just kind or generous, how can that be a bad thing? But there's always a possibility. Suppose that someone's generous, meaning that they're willing to give of themselves and they're not so stingy that they always withhold on giving. If they're generous and have a good will, then they'll give to the right things. But suppose that they have a bad will, that means, oh, I'm willing to cut checks for terrorist organizations or to promote criminal misbehavior that's wrong or exploitative or scamming people. So like all the qualities that are given here, it just depends. They can be good, they can be bad. Now, which thing is unconditionally good in all circumstances? One more, though. I want to not pause. I want to take a step back and make one more point. He also listed happiness as one of those things that generally people think of as ultimately good. Of course, Mill thought that that was the absolute good worth pursuing in life, and that's why we should maximize it to the greatest degree possible. But now we're talking about Kant, and Kant doesn't agree with this. He says that even happiness can be something bad if the person who has the happiness has a bad will. Why? So, if you see evil people with bad and wicked intentions feeling so happy and pleased with themselves, it probably doesn't give you some kind of warm, fuzzy feeling. It's rather a little bit disgusting, to see people that are evil enjoying the greatest heights of happiness. And furthermore, if they're happy, that provides them with no motive to really change their pattern of behavior. Also, and I'll make this point in connection with some more contemporary observations, you guys have probably noticed that sometimes people can become happy or gain pleasure from doing terrible, immoral things, right? Do you know, of course you know, I'm sure, but I'll just say it, that there's people in this world right now who find it enjoyable to watch sickening and disgusting images of like sexual exploitation or violence. Sometimes people, I've read about this in the media, like in the Washington Post just a little while ago, these terrible cases of people that will catfish young high schoolers or middle schoolers pretending to be like their peers so that they can solicit from them like sexually suggestive videos or photos, and then use that as blackmail against them to get them to do even more salacious things in front of, like, say, a webcam, under the threat that they're going to reveal these photos to loved ones, friends, or like school administrators if they don't do it. And these are people that, like, the community of individuals that do those things are like predators, right? And they actually sometimes have circles that they communicate with each other about these things in the dark web, where they will like kind of virtually high five each other and laugh at the exploitative behavior. And in many cases, or at least in some cases, the victims have committed suicide. Anyway, I'm just giving you a very, kind of vivid example of case where people can derive pleasure from the worst possible behavior. So even if pleasure is being generated, is it always good? Morally speaking, Kant would say no. So instead, what we should focus on is the thing that's always good no matter what. That's the goodwill. If you have a goodwill, then what's the worst that can happen? The worst is like the case we mentioned before, where you do something with the best of intentions, but it doesn't play out in the way that you might have liked in terms of the consequences. But even in those cases, we don't fault the person's moral character or their will and say that that was a bad thing. So unlike all these other qualities that we were talking about, even happiness itself, there's only one thing that stands apart as an unconditionally good thing, good in every scenario, and that's the goodwill. So let me read a few of the words of Kant. This is just out of our textbook, and I have the physical copy here. So he says this exactly on page 85. He says, nothing can possibly be conceived of in this world or even outside of it, which can be called good with no qualification, except a goodwill, intelligence, wit, judgment, and the other talents of the mind, however they may be named, courage, resolution, perseverance. These qualities of temperament are undoubtedly good and desirable in many respects, but these gifts of nature may also become extremely bad and mischievous if the will which makes use of them is not good. It is the same with gifts of fortune. I should have mentioned this too, but he also gives another set of qualities. They're not really character traits, but they're rather what he calls gifts of fortune. They're still things that are generally thought desirable. And in that category, he lists power, wealth, prestige. And so suppose that a person has a lot of power. Again, same kind of logic point. That could be a good thing if they have a good will, but if they have a bad will, like one student mentioned earlier, then they're just an evil dictator. And you'd rather that a person with a bad will doesn't have immense power. Or wealth, another similar example. Wealth, of course, gives you the capacity to take more actions in the world or to have more influence, to have more effectiveness in the outcomes that you're trying to promote. But if you have a bad will and you're empowered by wealth, then that's also something that can generally be destructive and harmful in a way that wouldn't be the case if the person with the bad will was penniless and poor. So let me keep reading. I just wanted to introduce that note about the so-called gifts of fortune, which are like adjacent to character traits. He says here, power, riches, honor, even health, and the general well-being and contentment with yourself, which is called happiness, can inspire pride and presumption if there is not a good will to correct the influence of them on the mind, and with this to rectify the whole principle of acting. So then he has this, I think, revealing quotation. He says, the sight of a being who is not adorned with a single feature of a pure and good will, enjoying unbroken prosperity, can never give pleasure to an impartial, rational spectator. Thus, a good will appears to constitute the indispensable condition of even being worthy of happiness. So if you want to prioritize the thing that's good in all conditions, no matter what, then he says you should try to make sure that you maintain and perpetuate a good will within yourself. So I've just tried now to emphasize the sort of centrality of the goodwill concept for Kant's ethics. But now some of you, I'm sure, and it's a fair thing to be thinking, are wondering, what does he mean, though, by that goodwill? Is it just some kind of informal, unspoken idea that we kind of have a general vibe as to what it means? That's actually not it. He thinks that there's something specific that a goodwill amounts to. So let me tell you what exactly he means by this phrase goodwill, and then we're going to expand on that further. And welcome, Karen. Not to worry. Good to see you. I'm glad you're here. So in Kant's usage and thought, the goodwill is this thing. It is when a rational being acts out of respect So when a rational being acts from a sense of duty to uphold some law or principle. I'm going to put it as to uphold the moral law. So in a more precise way of phrasing it, this is the definition of goodwill to Kant. It is the thing that is demonstrated or exhibited when a rational being, like, again, an intelligent being like us that can talk and use reason, whenever a rational being acts out of a sense of duty to like obey or respect some moral law or principle, that's when you're exhibiting and showing the goodwill. So we should, he thinks, always try to make sure that when we act from duty to adhere to the moral law, and that's what a goodwill would be. Now, furthermore, he says that the motive of your action has to be duty in order for you to have moral worth associated with your action. So notice this word duty is being invoked. Duty is something that, according to Kant, only rational creatures can comprehend or live according to. You understand, like when you act according to duty, that means that you regulate yourself, and sometimes you even withhold on an action that would greater promote your own enjoyment or happiness because you recognize that morality forbids you from doing it. Okay, so like there's obviously opportunities all the time for us to transgress morality. We could be lying, cheating, stealing all the time, and in many cases we could probably get away with it, let's be honest. But there's something that holds us back. There's this sense within us that we shouldn't do that, even if it would be easy to get away with and even benefit from, because we have a feeling of moral duty not to do so. Now, if you were like, say, a person that was, able to steal something from the store and you just know that there's no cameras on you and there's no one that can finally catch you, I'm sure most of you would still decline to steal, not because you're thinking, well, I'm obviously going to get caught, but just because you think it's wrong, But if there's, say, like an animal, there's no concept of theft that they can possess. I mean, if there's some incentive that they have, then their instincts impel them to pursue it regardless of, rules. Even a small case like this. Suppose I have a roommate and we've designated two different, I should say, shelves of the refrigerator as our own, and we're not supposed to take food from the other person, right? Suppose that I'm really hungry one day and my own shelf is empty because I haven't bought any food, but there's some of my favorite items on my roommate's shelf in the fridge, and they're not home. Now, when I open the fridge and I'm hungry, I might very much like to take that item. But if you're acting from a sense of duty, then you'd be like, well, I've got to withhold on it or find a different option, because even though that's what I would immediately enjoy, I recognize that it violates like the rules of the house and etc. But an animal, given an opportunity to eat something, is not going to be thinking, well, does this belong to somebody else? What are my obligations here? Do I have to, decline the gratification of the act because there's something morally wrong about doing it? So a unique capacity of humans is to feel a sense of duty that binds us to certain actions or withholding from certain actions. And in the chat here, what happens when duties conflict? Does he offer a hierarchy of duties? Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think in his view, your duty is going to be specified by the context once we get to this concept of the categorical imperative. So we'll circle back to your comment in a little bit, because there is a little more detail to still add to this whole discussion of duty, but I'm just kind of introducing it for the time being, yeah. But very good. Thank you, Marina, for that. Okay, so we act from a goodwill when we act from a sense of duty to uphold the moral law. And he says that it's only when an act is done from the motive of duty that it has moral value or worth. So let me add that point to the chat as well. So the new comment that I typed says this: only an act done from the motive of duty has moral worth, according to Kant, but an act that's done from the motive of inclination has no moral worth. So we now need to understand the difference between the motive of duty as the motive behind a person's action, and then the motive of inclination as a different and distinct motive of a person's action. To make sense of this, let's ask, does anyone have a feeling or background idea of what the word inclination means? Let me help prompt you to it as you're getting your thoughts together and maybe typing something out. If I have an inclination to get like tacos for dinner tonight, what am I saying in other like less sophisticated words? If I have an inclination to go for a run, what are we really saying in more basic terms? You say more likely to do it. You say craving to do it, Anthony. Something you prefer or are likely to do, sure. It's not just likelihood, because likelihood could have nothing to do with my desires. I could say that it's likely to rain tomorrow, but that has nothing to do with my will because I'm not in control of it. So it has a little bit more to do with what some of you are saying, which is just wanting to or desiring to do something. So that's correct. And let me just make that clear by typing it in. Inclination. Inclinations are just desires or wants. It doesn't have to be an impulse. I mean, it can be in certain cases, but it can also be something that's a more stable preference that you have over time, But at any rate, the general idea of an inclination is doing something for your own personal satisfaction because you desire it or want it. Now, what Kant is saying then in the above comment is that when you do an act from the motive of wanting to do it for your own personal pleasure or happiness, that's an inclination, the act lacks moral value. Doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that it doesn't have any moral characteristic to it. So what he's saying is the only situation where an act does have moral value is when it's done strictly from the motivation of duty. Now, to understand this concept of an act that's done from duty as opposed to inclination, Kant kind of helps us understand that a little bit with this interesting hypothetical scenario of the shopkeeper. So I'm going to talk to you about the shopkeeper example that Kant talks about. And again, this example that we're now going to mention is Kant's method or way of trying to tell the reader like what he really means when he says that an act done from the motive of duty is one that has moral worth, but one with inclination as the motive doesn't have any. So I got a couple textbooks with Kant in it. It's the same reading, but this one has like a little bit of an easier font for me to read through. So just give me 2 seconds while I scroll to the page. All right, page 105. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about this shopkeeper example, then I'll read you some quotes that are in the book about it. So here's the hypothetical. And by the way, hypothetical scenarios, they're definitely a common feature of philosophical writing and analysis. So hypothetical scenarios are like just imaginary or counterfactual situations that we contemplate in order to formulate intuitions or to advance principles within an argument. So just kind of like buckle up and get used to that, because this is going to be a constant feature that you're going to see in like all the philosophers' writings. But anyway, here we go. So here's the hypothetical. It's not too outlandish. Suppose there's a person who owns and operates like a shop, and this is maybe put it on par with like a modern day convenience store that just sells items to people, like a little liquor store or, at the gas station type of place. So suppose at this particular establishment, the guy that owns and operates it's working the counter, and he also tends the cash register. Now, into the store walks a young child, and we're talking about like school age, 7-year-old type child, very young, inexperienced overall. And they see an item they'd like to purchase. Maybe let's say it's a candy bar. So they walk with the candy bar to the counter and they say, "Excuse me, how much is this?" Now let's flip over to the perspective of the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper sees the young person asking the price. And as they're asking that price, the shopkeeper realizes this, that if they really wanted to, they could easily rip the kid off by telling them that the price is actually more than the true retail value. So we're talking about a shopkeeper who's tempted by the possibility of gouging the price, inflating how much it costs, so that this young person will pay more than what it's really worth, and therefore they'll get additional profit from the transaction. And why do we suppose that it's a child? Because obviously children are inexperienced and they basically take what they hear as a given. So he could easily, get away with this. And maybe he's really tempted by that possibility because he would love to get the extra money for whatever reason. So he's thinking about it and he's like, okay, well, he's asking how much it costs. Now let's suppose the true retail value of this thing is like $1. But he's thinking, I could tell him it's 4, I could tell him it's 5. He's not going to know any better, and I could then just get that extra cash. But as he's doing that, as he's thinking that, another thought occurs to him. And he's like in his mind going back and forth, and he says this, "Ah, yeah, but what about ethics, though? I remember studying something about Kant a long time ago, and you're supposed to do the right thing. You're supposed to follow your moral duties. So on the one hand, I really want to rip him off, but on the other hand, it's just wrong to do that. So what do I do? I'm conflicted." Finally, the shopkeeper opens his mouth and he's like, "Sorry, youngster, I was just lost in thought for a minute. But look, anyway, I guess it's $1. Okay, it's $1. That's how much it costs." Kid's like, "Okay, thank you. I don't know why you sound a little annoyed, but here you go. Here's your $1. He pays for it. Transaction's over, and the kid leaves. Now, if you followed and paid attention to my example, question really quick: did the shopkeeper ultimately give the fair price to the young person? That one's pretty straightforward. Yes or no? Yes, he did. Okay, good. He did, in fact, give the right price, although there was a little bit of an internal struggle and some deliberation over whether to do it because he felt like ripping him off. He ultimately went with morality. He ultimately did his duty, even though he didn't really want to. Okay. Now, I give you an alternative version of the same scenario. Let's try version 2. In the second version, it's much similar to the first. We still have a shopkeeper. We have a child that comes in asking the price of a product. Let's say it's $1. And in this case, though, the shopkeeper has a whole different mentality. When he sees the kid ask, "How much does this cost?" with like no hesitation, right away, he just fires back, "Oh, you wonder how much it costs? I'll tell you, it's $1, my young friend. It's $1 for me and for you and for anybody else. Isn't that beautiful? That's just fairness." And the kid's like, "Okay, I guess." And he pays the $1 and transaction's over. Now, in the second version, did the shopkeeper give the fair price again? Don't overthink it. It's pretty straightforward, but that's for you to say. We saw the first version, he did give the fair price. In the second version, yes, he also gave the fair price. So in both cases, the action at the end of the day was the same action. But notice this, that they had different motives. In one case, the person did it strictly for the sake of duty. And in the other case, the person did it because they feel pleasure or happiness from doing the right thing. So out of those two individuals, shopkeeper 1 or 2, whose action was motivated by duty alone and not from inclination because they didn't even want to do it? It's a little counterintuitive, maybe, but there's a clear enough answer. Which one's action was done from strict duty? It was the first, that's correct. It was the first person's action that was motivated by duty alone. Jasmine, you say 2. Now, about the second person, they did the same action, but they did it because they found it pleasurable and enjoyable. It's like they did it out of love for children and for fairness and all the rest. Maybe it makes them feel so good and gratified that they did that they've got this like satisfying, warm, fuzzy psychological after effect for like a long time. But notice that even though it was the right action, it wasn't done from a moral basis. It was done out of the pursuit of the pleasure associated with the right action. So it's not actually done solely from duty. The clearest case, according to Kant, in which a person does an action only from duty is when they have a disinclination to do the right thing, but nonetheless, they hold themselves to the moral standard regardless because they recognize that like duty compels them to do that. So it might sound a bit odd to you, but what Kant does say is that out of those two examples, it is the first shopkeeper's action that has any kind of moral worth. The second person's action is not wrong, it's not immoral, but it's kind of like amoral because it's not done with any moral basis. It's done strictly out of pleasure. Now, if you do actions because the main motive behind it is doing what makes you happy, like what the utilitarian had said, then sometimes that will align with what your duty is, according to Kant, but in many other cases it won't. So what we really should be following is the moral law out of a sense of duty. It's not always going to lead us to happiness, but what Kant says is that that doesn't matter. What matters is rational, duty-based actions that adhere to the moral law or the moral standard of actions. So let me read a little bit from Kant, and I'll put this point to you through his words. He says here, I set aside actions which are in accordance with duty, yet to which men have no immediate inclination, but perform them because they are impelled thereto by some other inclination. In this case, to decide whether the action which is in accordance with duty has been done from duty or from some selfish purpose is easy. This difference is more difficult to note in a case where the action accords with duty and the subject has, in addition, an immediate inclination to do the action. So now we get this shopkeeper case. He says, for example, that a dealer should not overcharge an inexperienced purchaser certainly accords with duty. And where there is much commerce, the prudent merchant does not overcharge, but keeps a fixed price for everyone in general, so that a child may buy from him just as well as everyone else may. Thus, customers are honestly served. But this is not nearly enough to make us believe that the merchant has acted this way from duty or from principles of honesty. His own advantage required him to do it. He cannot, however, be assumed to have in addition an immediate inclination toward the buyer, causing him, as it were, out of love, to give no one, as far as price is concerned, any advantage over another. In that case, the action was done merely from a selfish purpose. So he also kind of mentions in that example I just read that we can imagine the case where the shopkeeper gives the fair price to the child because he's afraid of being harmed in perspective of his interests if this fact was somehow revealed later, and then that would harm his profit-seeking interests. So suppose he gives the fair price, but only because he's worried that like maybe the child will come to know that he was ripped off, put a negative Yelp review or something, and then that's going to hurt his business. But in that case, again, it's not done strictly from the sake of duty. It's done because there's a perspective towards his own self-advantage, and therefore it's mixed together with his inclinations. So the clearest case in which the action's done solely from the motivation of duty is when you recognize that you don't really want to do it out of your own personal desire, but you hold yourself to do it anyway. It really has nothing to do with karma, actually, Jasmine, because we're not saying that if he was to do the wrong thing, he's going to accumulate negative karma that's going to come back to harm him. It could just be the consequences. But I understand your reference to karma. Normally we talk about karma, at least in the West. It's a little different understanding in Hinduist religion. But some people think, what goes around comes around kind of thing. And I guess that's one way to think about it. But if he's only doing it for that reason, then it's because he's trying to protect his own self-interests, not because he's doing it strictly because the principle of honesty requires it from him. Now, when I first read this stuff by Kant a long time ago, and when I was in graduate school, studying it at a kind of higher level, I always found the shopkeeper example a little weird, and I'm sure some of you feel that it's a little counterintuitive, because many of you are probably thinking, well, isn't the second person in the second version of the case like better as a human, because he doesn't have to like talk himself into doing the right thing, even though he doesn't want to. He just feels like doing it, and it makes him happy to do it. So wouldn't that be a better case of a moral individual? But having taught it a lot and thought more about it, I feel like I start to understand Kant's point. And let me put it in a slightly different format, and then we're moving on to the next part of these notes on Kant. And what Kant's generally, I think, saying is that we should only really award moral credit or value to an action that's not done because it pleases you already. In that case, it's not really done because it's the right thing to do. It's done because it's gratifying to you in some kind of self-interested way. Let me give you another variation on the kind of example that he's thinking about so that maybe it will be even clearer. Let's take a case of two people that are each on a highly restrictive diet. Person number one, so they have this diet, and let's suppose that there's like no sweets, no fatty foods, no fried foods, just a whole bunch of like complex grains and like macrobiotic things. And to this first individual on this diet, they just hate that. They find no pleasure in it. They keep wishing that they could stop the diet and just go back to eating whatever other maybe unhealthier foods that they think are tastier. But suppose that this first person that's taking this diet on recognizes some kind of duty or responsibility to their own good health. So despite the fact that they're like, this is so gross and they kind of hate it, they just stick with it nonetheless because they feel that obligation. Okay, that's person one. Now, another person, let's say, is on the exact same diet, like this super healthy, but maybe to many people not enjoyable, like Tom Brady style, diet. But the second person I'm referring to loves that food. That's their favorite food. In fact, they wouldn't have it any other way. When they see people eating like sweets, fried foods, and etc., they're like, ew, so gross. But when they see like a big plate of macrobiotic greens, they're like, yummy, that's my favorite food. Now, out of those two people, which one of the two do you think it would be more common sense to say, credit is due to you for holding to this diet? Like, I should award you some kind of moral praise for taking that diet. The one for whom it is difficult, or the one for whom it's just their favorite food? It is the first one, of course, Mary Jane, yes. It wouldn't make any sense to go up to someone eating like literally their favorite meal and be like, good job, you're doing the right thing. Because they're not doing it out of the sake of any principle. They're doing it just because it happens to gratify them. So like back to the shopkeeper example, the first person does the right thing, but they do it because it's moral, even though it's not easy. The second person also does the right thing, but it's not done from a moral basis. They're doing it because of the satisfaction or the self-interest that's bound up with the same action. So it really kind of, I think Kant's point is that, morality and credit for the action on a moral basis really doesn't make sense to award a person when they're doing it simply because of the self-interest that they have in the action to begin with. If I run a mile every day, but I hate it because I just don't like running, but I think it's healthy, and another person runs a mile every day because they're like a lover of running and they get runner's high, according to Kant, it doesn't really make sense to say moral credit is due to the second party because, after all, they find pleasure in it. So they don't have a moral framework for doing the act. Even though it's not wrong, it becomes something that lacks moral value. Okay, so now, one big question that's still looming over this discussion of Kant, and the one that I'm sure some of you have been thinking about, he says we should act from a sense of duty to uphold the moral law, and that only when your act is motivated by duty does it have moral worth. But there's this phrase or concept of the moral law that's been introduced. Like, we should act from a sense of duty to respect and abide by the moral law. And you may be wondering, well, what does he mean by the moral law, though? Like, what exactly is that? How could we ever know what it is? We're expected to act from a feeling of duty to adhere to the moral law, but what is it? Well, it's interesting because Kant actually does think that there is a universal, objective moral law. Except to Kant, this moral law, it's not something that was written down in, say, like a theological text. It's not like something that's given to us by governments. Instead, he thinks the moral law is something that is discoverable by reason. So reason, rationality that we have that makes us human beings that are more intelligent than the other animals. He says that same feature of reason that can be utilized to like discover nuclear physics or technology or math or geometry, trigonometry, that same powerful tool of reason, he thinks, can also be applied to the concept of morality. And just as much as we can discover these important scientific concepts through reason, we can also discover the moral law through the use of reason. So Kant thinks there's a moral law that we can learn and discover if we apply reason to the contemplation of morality. But when we use this reason, whether it comes from God, whether it comes from evolution, this is just an open question, but definitely we as humans have it. That's why we're able to even engage in this kind of interaction here. He says when we use reason to unlock or tap into the moral law, we will reflect on a certain rational principle, which he thinks helps us to determine the moral law. And this is like a concept, this is like the core concept really of Kant's ethics that we've been building up to. So how do we learn the moral law? By using reason to contemplate the categorical imperative. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what this categorical imperative thing is now. So the categorical imperative is a principle which, again, if we reflect on it when we do something, it will guide us towards whether the action is permitted, not permitted, or an obligation. And the categorical imperative, he thinks there's two versions of it. There's two separate versions of it, and they each tell us basically the same things, whether they're required or forbidden, but they sound different, the two versions of the categorical imperative. So I'm going to tell you first about version 1 of that categorical imperative concept. And so I'm putting it in the chat as like the categorical imperative V1, meaning version 1, and then I'll state the definition. So here's what it says. Now, forgive me because the first way of putting it in, when you first encounter it in writing, it may sound a little technical or obscure, but I'll unveil and reveal to you exactly what it all means. So first version of the categorical imperative, which again is how we're supposed to like realize what the moral law is. It tells you act always so that the maxim of your action could be willed to be a universal law. So I'm going to write that out. Okay, so there it is. You see it. The categorical imperative, version 1, act always so that the maxim which describes your action could be willed to be a universal law. All right, now I understand there's some jargon in there that has to be kind of opened up and understood before we'll be able to really dive into this. So let me explain. We have to know what is a maxim. Okay, so a maxim is just a term that is used by Kant, which refers to the principle of a person's action. You can think of a maxim as like an individual's policy statement that determines what they do under what circumstances. And for any deliberate action that a rational being like me or you does, there is a maxim associated with it. The maxim of an action can be understood in terms of the overall form of a maxim. So next I'm going to tell you what that format or form of a maxim looks like. So the form of a maxim is a principle that reads out like this. I will do some action X. We just label it as X because it could be any number of different possible actions. I will do X under circumstances C, or in circumstances C. So it says there, form of a maxim, I will do X in circumstances C. So what a maxim basically says is what action a person does and what circumstances in which they do the action. So take like the case of this lecture right now. One thing I know that you're doing is watching this lecture. And if you're watching the lecture, there's a maxim associated with it because it's not like you just randomly started watching it. You did it out of a deliberate intention. And I'm sure, let's just kind of characterize your maxim in the following way. I will attend a class lecture in the circumstances that is the day and time of the lecture according to my schedule. So that's like a basic maxim that I'm sure fairly describes your overall principle behind being here watching this right now. I will attend a lecture at the time that it's scheduled. Now, we might have to put in a little caveat because obviously sometimes you'll be sick, unavailable, undergoing some emergency that prevents your attendance. So we could qualify the maxim just slightly to be like, I will attend a lecture when I'm capable of attending it at the time and date that is scheduled. Okay, so that's maybe an expression of the maxim that you have. Now, to understand whether the action is morally permitted or wrong, we then have to consider what it would be if your personal maxim was converted into a universal law that applies to all people in the same circumstances. So we then have to, like they say, universalize the maxim. So now I'm going to put that in the chat, what the universal law statement of a maxim would be. The universalized version of the maxim just replaces the reference to I with all people. So it would be like, all people will do X in the same circumstances as I do it, namely C, whatever those circumstances are. Keep in mind, X and C are just two like placeholders, like variables that are used in math to stand for whatever the current example is. So in the current example, we tried this maxim. I will attend a lecture if I'm able to at the time that it is scheduled, in case it's the time scheduled by the professor or school. Now, what would be the universalized version of that? It would simply say that all people will attend their lectures when they're able to, in circumstance that that's the time and date of the class meeting. And the only point to take away now is that if all people did abide by that universalized maxim, there would be nothing contradictory about that. There would be nothing undesirable about that. That would just mean that people go to their duly scheduled meetings when they're healthy enough to be there. And that doesn't pose any kind of absurdity, inconsistency, or contradiction. So congratulations, your attendance today, according to that maxim anyway, is morally permitted, and there's nothing wrong with it. But the more interesting case of the categorical imperative version 1 to think about are the actions that it rules out as immoral, because it would not be possible for all to act according to that maxim without contradiction or without undesirable effects. So let's try another example so that you can kind of get a feeling for how this will regulate our actions and tell us that some things actually are wrong. I'm going to give you an example that Kant himself uses, and then we will spin off from there into other variations of the same kind of example. But let's take the case of a person who's low on money. Okay, so they're kind of low on cash at this time, but they would like to get some additional money. Now notice in this example that this person, let's suppose, has a friend, or I don't know if we should say they're friends, but they know a person anyway, who has a lot of extra money. And so the person with like low cash flow wants to ask this other person for some money because then they could get the money, but they know something. They know that that other person will only agree to give them the money if they promise to what? Let's see if you can finish my thought here. So we got a person that's low on cash. They'd like to get more. They know they have like a wealthier acquaintance, and they're thinking, I'm going to ask them for some money, but they know they'll only be given it if they promise that person that they will what? Pay it back. That's correct, Mary Jane. that if they will only issue them the loan or whatever it is if they promise to repay it as though it is a loan. So suppose that our penniless friend here wants to ask for that loan, and that means they're going to have to make a promise of repayment within a certain fixed time. But suppose that this person who's going to request the money has a very, let's say, unethical thought in mind, which is this. They're thinking like, okay, I know that they'll only give it to me if I promise to repay it, and therefore I'm going to promise to repay it, but I'm not actually going to repay it. I'm just going to say that I will so that they'll give it to me in the first place, and then once I've got the money, I'm just like going to ghost them, and they'll never see me or hear from me again. So you understand the example? It's like a person that's going to make a false promise of repayment just to secure the money in the first place with no intention or actually a deliberate intention not to repay it, okay? Now, ask yourself, this lying borrower, what is their maxim? Their maxim would be something like, I will make a false promise to repay money in the circumstance that I just want extra money, okay? Now, if that was a universal law, imagine what that would mean. That would mean that all people who promise to repay loans would what? If this maxim was elevated to the status of a universal rule, then it would mean that all people who request loans will what? They'll act the same way as this person. So that means that they would all do what? Go ahead, let me know when you're ready. Lie to borrow money, yes. If this was the general universal law, then every borrower who ever borrows money would make false promises to repay the money and not pay it back actually. Now, if that was the universal law, then would lending even exist in the first place? Let me know. If every single borrower told a lie about repaying the loan, would loans even exist? No, they would not exist, because what would all the lenders know in this hypothetical circumstance? If every borrower was lying when they took out the loan, the lenders would know that, and therefore they would have no reason to grant the loans in the first place. So now let's consider again the action of the individual that tells this lie. Do they really want everybody to lie the same way they are doing in the same situation? Actually, they don't want that, because if everybody did it, then their own lie would no longer be plausible. What they really want is for most other people, except for them, of course, to tell the truth about their intention to repay a loan, so that when they make their own lie, it will be at least presumably true to the person who is going to perhaps lend the money. So do you kind of see what I'm saying here? This is an action that's therefore immoral, because it could not be universalized without contradiction. If every borrower lies when they request loans, then loans would no longer be granted in the first place, and therefore the action would no longer achieve its intended outcome. So what Kant is saying then, beneath the somewhat technical appearance of the principles that we're mentioning, is something that I hope in a way is kind of straightforward to you. And let's see if we can finish this thought of mine. This is just a reformulation of this principle. Kant says that it's only morally permitted to take actions that it would be possible for who to do? It's only okay for you to do it if it would be possible for what? Let's know. Only permissible if it's possible for everyone to do it. That's right. So when you're doing an action, according to the categorical imperative version 1, you should simply think it through in this way. What if everybody else also did the same thing as me? And if everybody doing that would either be impossible or undesirable, then you know that it's wrong for you to do it too. Like, why would you do something if you knew that if all did it, it would be something chaotic, contradictory, or just not desirable? You say here, Bihan, isn't there a term for that? Creating a culture of honesty to lie or be dishonest for the means to take advantage. I'm not sure what the term would be. It seems like it must be something that's been stated in another context, but without me having the reference at hand, I can't really confirm that. But it does seem like it's a general concept that we've probably heard of in another case, because a lot of people have been influenced by the ideas of Kant, and there also is like a sort of deep reservoir of common sense that aligns with a lot of what he's saying too. But to the point, let's just read some of Kant's words on this, okay? Because I want you to hear it from the man himself. He talks about this false borrower example in connection with the first version of the categorical imperative. So here's what he says. A man in need finds himself forced to borrow money. He knows well that he will not be able to repay it, but he sees also that he will not get a loan unless he firmly promises to repay it within a fixed amount of time. He wants to make the promise, but he still has enough conscience to ask himself whether it is not permissible and is contrary to his duty to get out of difficulty in this way. Suppose, however, that he does decide to do that. The maxim of his action would then be expressed as follows: when I believe myself to be in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to pay it back, although I know that I will not pay it back. Now, this principle may perhaps be quite compatible with his well being, but the question is now whether it is morally right. So I then transform the principle into a universal law and put the question thus: how would things stand if my maxim were to become a universal law? He then sees at once that such a maxim could never hold as a universal law of nature and be consistent with itself, but must necessarily be self contradictory, because the universality of a law which says that anyone believing himself to be in difficulty could promise whatever he pleases with the intention of not keeping the promise would make promising itself and the goal to be achieved by it impossible, because no one would believe what was being promised then, but would merely laugh at all such promises as being obviously false. So we already know then that what the false borrower is doing is wrong, because they're taking an action that could not be done by all and still have the entire system of lending and borrowing exist any longer. Okay, with that one example, I hope you kind of get the vibe or idea of the first version of the categorical imperative, but let me offer you a couple of additional others that are just making the same point in a slightly different case. Let's take a person who wants to ride the subway. So they're going to be a passenger on the subway system, but they don't want to pay the fare. So this person, let's suppose, is a person that's like the free rider on the subway system. They will jump over the turnstile, enter the doors, get a ride to wherever, but they didn't pay any fare for that. So they're riding for free. Now, what's the maximum of their action? When I want to ride the subway, I'm not going to pay it. The circumstances are I want to ride it, and the action is not paying. Now, if that was universal law, then who would be paying for the subway then? If everyone acted according to that person's principle, then universalizing that would mean that who pays for the subway anymore? Nobody would, exactly. If everybody did exactly what that one person is doing, then everyone would try to hop the turnstile, and there would no longer be any funding for the subway from the passengers or patrons. And if that was the case, would the subway system still function? Would it still be running with no payment coming in from anybody? That's an obvious one, but you'll tell me. No, clearly not. So here again, we see an action which, if done by all, would make the entire system in which the action is performed cease to exist. And that's why he says it's somebody doing something wrong that does that. Now, notice this. This is, I think, an interesting feature of Kant's morality and ethical system. What he's telling you is these moral laws, these duties that we have, they're not being like imposed on you by like an authority figure outside of yourself. It's not like society or, religion or like some kind of dictator figure that says to you, here's what's right and wrong, and you just have to obey regardless of whether you think so or not. No, instead he says it's reason within you that can ascertain that your action is wrong, because you already know when you think about it that it would not be possible for everybody to do the same thing. So it's kind of like these moral laws are self-regulating from within the rational agent's own autonomy. Your own mind can contemplate the universalization of your maxim and can then determine whether that would be right or wrong. So it's rationality, which we have as a sort of universal human possession. That's the thing that is the arbiter of right and wrong. It's not something that is imposed on you. It's something that's coming from within, because it's your own reason that can think it through and determine, this is not something that would work if everybody did it. So, if you want to follow Kant's ethics, then you have to act from a sense of duty to respect the moral law. And the moral law can be revealed to you if you apply reason to the contemplation of the categorical imperative. And the first version of the categorical imperative, as we've learned, says that you're morally only permitted to take actions that it would at least be possible for all to do and not undesirable for all to do. So take the free rider again. Does the free rider that doesn't pay when they ride the subway, do they want everybody else to act in the same exact way? No, of course, because if everybody did the same thing they're doing, then there would no longer be any system for them to exploit and ride on for free. And of course, they want to ride on the subway system. So they would like for most everybody, except for them, to actually pay. And then they deviate from the rule that they even recognize rationally has to be held in order for there to be a system in the first place. Okay, so Kant has this tendency, I think, and especially during the time period that he wrote, to be very verbose and use a lot of technical terms. But I think that the kernel of truth that lies at the heart of what he's saying is something that's a little bit easier, I hope, for you to grasp, which is just that you should always check with reason whether you're acting on a principle that could potentially be done by all. And if it cannot be done by all, because that would be either impossible or undesirable, then it's wrong for you to do it too. I'll give you just one more. Suppose there's a long line and you're maybe sort of towards the back of the line. So it's like frustrating, when there's a big long line and you've got to wait, but there's other people in the world, so you just got to wait your turn. But anyway, suppose though that you're that impatient and you're thinking to yourself, I got to get in there quicker. I got to somehow get into this event or building sooner than I would get in if I just waited forever in the line. So at that moment, some person, probably not a good person like you, but maybe some person might choose to do what thing? If you follow my example, the long line example, person doesn't like being waiting that long toward the back. They're thinking, I'm just going to do what? Cut the line, exactly. Cut the line, advance to a closer position toward the entrance so that you don't have to wait as long. Now imagine if your maxim then is when there's a long line, I'm going to cut. That's the maxim of the cutter. When there's a long line and I'm waiting, I'm going to cut the line. What would it be if that was universalized? It would be that when there's a long line, who's cutting? Of course, the answer is everyone. And would it be possible for there to even be a line if everybody was trying to cut, like 100% of the people were trying to cut? Of course not. It would just devolve into like a chaotic scramble of people all cutting each other toward the entrance of the building. And there would no longer be any like regulated system of entry for people to go. Now, does the cutter want everyone to cut? Actually, no, because then it would defeat the whole purpose of what they're doing. If everybody cut, then once the cutter cut, they would just be cut and they would not gain any new advantageous position in the line. What the cutter really wants is for all the other people to respect the rules of the line and wait their turn so that when they deviate from said rule, they can take advantage over the rule followers by breaking the rule. But if everybody mutually broke that rational requirement, then there would no longer be any such thing as the line, and there would no longer be any way to determine how people are going to get in at all. So again, just think about when you're doing something, whether it would be possible for all to do that. Like, I think about it sometimes in connection with like plagiarism, for example. Suppose that you're going to turn in a paper you didn't write, and you're thinking, when they assign me papers, I'm not going to write them. I'm going to have someone else or like AI do it. That's a maxim that someone can, and in fact, sadly, many people do act by, maybe not many, but some. Suppose that was universalized. It would be the statement, all people, when they're given assignments in school, will not perform the work. If that was the case, then what's the point of school anymore? If everybody was going to cheat, then why should we even hold classes? If no one wants to learn anything, then we can just sort of call it a day and say we're done with learning things like we've done for thousands of years, which would defeat the entire purpose of even holding the classes, because they're supposed to like instruct people and actually give them information that they then retain on their own. So, if everybody cheats, then there's no point to even having a system that people are cheating in. If I was going to like cheat on the bar exam to become a lawyer, then I would be acting on a maxim that if it was universalized, there would be no qualified lawyers. And then why would I even want to be a member of that field? Because none of them would actually be qualified to do their work. So, you want to make sure, according to Kant at least, that when you're doing something, it's conceivable for all to act in the same way. And if it's inconceivable or undesirable, then it's reason that's telling you that that's wrong. And you should check yourself and not do that. Now, I told you there's two versions of the categorical imperative, and there are. So there's the first one that we just kind of covered. And to be fair, that's like a little bit the more complicated one. The second one I think is a little more straightforward, even though now having explained it, I hope that version 1 makes some reasonable sense. I'm going to just quickly say in the chat what version 2 is, and then I think we'll probably have to pause there until we get back on Tuesday to finish just the last, say, 5-10 minutes of this discussion of Kant. Then we're going to transition into our notes on abortion. We'll start really getting into the ethical issues that we want to study in the class. But we had to have, a good, fair opening sequence in the course, just talking about these ethical theories. So let me just put in the chat one time the second version of Kant's categorical imperative, and then I'm going to leave you maybe in suspense until Tuesday when we kind of wrap that up. So okay, so I'm labeling it as categorical imperative V2 to mean version 2. Okay, so what the second one says is, never treat another human being as a means to an end. Always treat human beings as ends in themselves. So So you see it there, categorical imperative version 2. Do not ever treat another human being as though they're a means to an end. Instead, always treat humanity in others and in yourself as an end in itself or as an end in themselves. So this will just take a few moments of discussion. We'll have to return back to an earlier comment that we had about what are means versus ends, which we did talk about when we were studying Mill, who said that the only end of all human action is happiness or pleasure, and everything else that we do is just a means to that end. But now Kant's applying the terminology of means and ends in his own writing. He says that it's never permissive, never morally permitted to treat a human being as though they're just a means to some end that you have. Now, before I close the discussion, just one last word, I guess. Can anybody remember what an end is one more time? Because we talked about it briefly before. If you have either good memory or notes, you might be able to quickly put that in the chat. But let me know. What's an end? It's a something. It's a goal, correct. It's a goal or an objective. And the means are the things that we do or the actions that we take to arrive at these various goals. So just keep that thought in mind and hold that thought, and we'll just return to that. We'll pick up where we left off here on Tuesday, and then we'll get into the Mary Ann Warren. So if you haven't already, try to read that Mary Ann Warren article called On the Moral and Legal Status of Abortion, and we'll see her perspective on abortion, which we'll get into after we have like a little 10-minute follow-up at the beginning, wrapping up our notes on Kant. But for now, I don't have anything I can cover in the last, say, 2 or 3 minutes, just that we still have until 5:15. So I'm going to go ahead and, shut this stream down. But while you're here, please, if you could say chat, goodbye or just a quick salutations. And then I'll see you guys next time. If you hadn't had a chance to put any comments in there, just do that just so I have a record of attendance, generally speaking. Okay, good. Thank you guys so much. Hope everything's going well. Sounds great, guys. Thank you all. And until next time, I'm just going to sign off for the time being, but have a good weekend. And as always, if you're needing anything at all, please email me. I'm checking my messages, every day or every other day at latest. So cool. All right, then have a good one, and we'll be in touch. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.